this time, in plain sight, you had the filming of a brutal lynching, public lynching by a white police officer of a black man, caught on camera, a 17-year-old black teenager, Darnella Fraser, very bravely captured not just the video, but George Floyd's dying words, "I can't breathe." And that sent shock waves of revulsion around the world. They say that a picture speaks 1,000 words. Well, a video speaks volumes. And that's why from Syria to Baghdad to, parts of Africa and most of the cities in Western Europe, and of course, Minneapolis, where this happened, and other cities in America, there's been huge outrage. People on the streets, led mainly by black youth, and I've been on all of the central London demonstrations that have been called by Black Lives Matter, and I've seen the vibrancy, I've seen the militancy of the youth, and I've also seen the solidarity from white people, mainly young, but other age groups represented as well, to the cause. And this is broader now than just George Floyd. Issues of deaths in custody in Britain have been raised. There have been 13 deaths of black people in custody since 2010. The list is Sean Rigg, Sarah Reed, Roger Sylvester, Sheku Bayu in Glasgow, Brian Douglas, Wayne Douglas, Mark Duggan, Rashan Charles, Christopher Alder, Colin Roach. Some of those were in prison, so it was prison officers. But not a single police officer has ever been prosecuted, despite findings in inquests of unlawful killing, which is the nearest a coroner's court comes to making a finding of murder. And so really the police have got a license to kill on both sides of the Atlantic, and the public have just said, enough is enough. No justice, no peace. And a high point for me in terms of symbolism was seeing the statue of that racist white supremacist, Edward Coulson, toppled in Bristol. This is a slave trader, a slave owner in Bristol, commemorated with a statue. And that statue should never have been put up in the first place, and should definitely have been taken down. And the people themselves.
It was erected, Mark, as well, long after his appalling crimes were well known. It was at really the height of British imperialism towards the end of the 19th century when the statue, I believe, was first erected. So certainly those that erected it can't claim ignorance. But the truth is, it's been there and should have been taken down long ago. But it's not just the symbolism of the statue. His legacy affects really the whole of Bristol. I mean, the street's named after him, as I understand it. Education, you've got the Coulson Hall, the concert hall. And this has prompted a very sharp debate in Bristol and indeed further afield. And I was interested really by the response, though, because my reaction was the same as yours, I've got to say. But I was interested in the response of the leader of the opposition, Keir Starmer, who said it was wholly wrong for the action to be taken. I mean, I don't know what your thoughts are about Sir Keir's response to the protest in Bristol. Any comment on that at all, Mark?
Well, I think he's tone deaf. He did say that the statue shouldn't have been in there in the first place, that it should have been taken down. But then he criticized, using his lawyer's hat, what he saw as lawlessness by the people who toppled the statue. And I just think he got the message wrong. You know, this is an issue of 400 years of brutal slavery that man represented. An affront, as the mayor of Bristol, my good friend Marvin Rees said, to black people like himself. And that's the note that he should be striking if he wants to maintain support from black people who are the pillar of Labour Party support. More than 70% of black people vote Labour. In 100 seats around the country, if it wasn't for black voters, white MPs mainly wouldn't get elected, white Labour MPs. And so he really needs to sort out his act And he needs to look at anti-Black racism and Afrophobia and Islamophobia in the Labour Party, which has been completely ignored. Black voters, Black members of the party have been taken for granted. I've been expelled from the Labour Party for speaking out. And so he's got a lot to do to win back our confidence. And there's now talk, actually, of Black candidates standing against Labour candidates, which I think will be a crying shame at any election because of what's seen as indifference or just outright hostility by the party and its current leadership.
No, indeed. I mean, I think there have been some voices that have spoken out, but I mean, I would like to see people in Parliament speaking out much more strongly and very clearly, because this is something which is going on for far too long now. The abuse that Black people have experienced, the inequality that exists, and it's very long overdue, it seems to me. I mean, the Race Relations Act was passed, in the late 60s, wasn't it, by the Wilson government? But, we still have a hell of a long way to go. Black people disproportionately represented in our prison service, just as they are in terms of being incarcerated, that is, just as they are over on the other side of the Atlantic. I'm told that there are more Black people in the States now incarcerated in prison doing work effectively for free than there were at the height of the slave trade in the States. So, things haven't really moved on that much over there. But I just wonder, though, just in terms of, is this a turning point? Is the difference, do you think, the advent of new technology and I know something you're very passionate about, citizen journalism. Is that what made the difference? I mean, because, I think you mentioned the young woman who actually filmed the brutal murder of, the lynching, as you put it, of George Floyd. These things have gone on for a long time, but have never been captured before because obviously the technology wasn't available to do so. Do you think that's what has made the difference this time, and what will make this a turning point?
Well, we know as two comrades that have been in the Labour movement more than 30 years, how difficult it is to get a big demonstration together.
Yes.
And yet the youth, they've managed to put tens of thousands of people onto the streets of cities. Yeah. I heard just yesterday of 14,000 in Nottingham, 15,000 in Bristol, hundreds of thousands in London, day after day, using Instagram, Facebook, Snapchat, Twitter, mainly Instagram, actually. Yeah. And it's almost what we used to call the flash protest, where you'd quickly mobile phone around and text around and get some people together, but not thousands. No. You'd be lucky if you got dozens or scores,
Well, I mean, I attended the Black Lives Matter rally in Derby, my home city, on the weekend, and it's probably the biggest rally by some distance that we've ever seen in Derby. Organized. What was great as well, it was organized by people who were, not sort of, if you like, of the traditional left, as far as I'm aware. And I think that's been replicated all over the place. And I was talking to a friend of mine who from Dorset, and they said there were over 1,000 people in Weymouth. Weymouth, not exactly renowned for its radical tradition, and yet, the revulsion, the outpouring that we've seen around the country and indeed around the world. I mean, big, as I understand it, big rallies and protest marches in Paris, in Berlin, I believe. So this really has struck a chord, it seems to me. And I just wonder what your thoughts are on how we build on that, and how can we, link the police brutality with other struggles, the kind of international sort of sense of imperialism, the way in which, the same forces who are essentially behind the exploitation of Black people, the inequality in this country and the States and elsewhere. Self-same characters, behind these imperialist wars. Britain effectively, a war machine, the United States a war machine, the military-industrial complex. And it's Black and brown people that are predominantly the victims of those imperialist wars. Do you have any thoughts about how those connections can be made and how we can, as it were, build a genuine sort of almost revolutionary movement to bring about the sort of change which is desperately needed.
Well, one of the slogans on the demo, or one of the 3 demos I went on quite recently, was "Make revolution irresistible." So people are making the connections. White silence is violence, pointing to our allies and saying, look, this has to go further than just George Floyd. This is about how we're treated at every level in society, in education, in housing, in terms of share of the wealth of this country. Black people, fueled with their free labor, paid for the Industrial Revolution in the 19th century. That's why you've got these slave traders and their statues without people remembering the backstory. You know, like Tate, you see all the Tate galleries around, the Tate libraries around.
Yeah.
He was a sugar plantation owner, Tate and Lyle, sugar. And there's a bust of him in Brixton, where I lived for 20 years. That needs to come down. Rhodes, Cecil Rhodes' bust or statue in Oxford needs to come down. You know, they were philanthropists, yes. How were they able to give to charity? But because they'd used the sweated free labor of captive Africans to build up their amass huge wealth. Yet that's not written about in the history books. No, so yes, I think the connections are being made. For instance, I saw another group of young students saying, why is my curriculum white? Why are my lecturers white? Where are the black lecturers? I see Raheem Sterling, the footballer, saying, where are the black managers? 30% of the Premier League players are black. And yet I don't think there's a single one in the Premier League now. You know, now Chris Hughton is no longer with Brighton. So, you know, people are making connections now beyond just talking about George Floyd. George Floyd is iconic, but he's a catalyst. And we must make sure that his death is not in vain. And I want to say this as a lifelong trade unionist. I think that the labor movement needs to step up to the mark now. And the TUC should be having conversations. Trade unions should be having conversations. The Labour Party should be having conversations with its black members about how we destroy what's called systemic racism now. That's the catchphrase. It used to be called institutional racism. I think we have to be careful with those phrases, though, because in a way, if you talk about systems in institutions, you're letting individuals off the hook. And we've got to tackle individual racism as well. You know, what happens in the workplace with your boss and how black workers are treated less favorably, how black workers in the NHS have been put into the front line and are dying at greater rates, you know, including in the general population than their white cohorts. So, you know, there's a lot to be tackled here. And I think the connections are being made, and our natural allies need to step up to the plate and join us, because everyone will benefit if we defeat our common oppressor. I mean, I actually believe it's capitalism.
Well, I was about to say, Mark,
behind this, and it's not just about.
It's think there's a class dimension that we need to be mindful of here as well?
Yes, I was just saying, I think race and class, and my good friend, now late, A. Sivanandan, started up the Institute of Race Relations, and their journal was called Race and Class. And I have, throughout my political activity, always made the connection between the two. As an active trade unionist, as a Labour Party member, although I was expelled for speaking out in 2016. That was under, sadly,
one of the earlier victims of the witch hunt, Mark. Yeah, absolutely.
Right, on Jeremy Corbyn's watch, unfortunately.
Sadly, indeed.
So the connections are being made. You know, you looked at Extinction Rebellion, and I went on the demos. Overwhelmingly white. You'd be, you know, it was spot the black person. Now it's completely reversed. Indeed. This is led by young black people. They're in the majority, but there's also a huge amount of white support as well across the board.
I find it very inspirational. I mean, the thing I went to in Derby, incredibly inspirational. It was, I mean, as I've said, it was huge, thousands there. I mean, regrettably, the media didn't cover it. I mean, they mentioned Nottingham, but Derby's a poor relation in the East Midlands to Nottingham, it seems. But huge numbers of people on the street and a huge, solidarity. It was truly uplifting. But I know a few people have said to me they've got concerns about attempts to kind of divide and rule. And I know that the kind of, for example, the grassroots Black Left movement, it's very clear. It's I think on your banner heading, African, Caribbean, and Asian socialists coming together. And I don't know if you picked up this, Mark. I'm sure you probably have, about this attempt to kind of drive a wedge, with it between, in the Black community and the kind of Asian community in that sense. And is that something you've picked up? I know some people have mentioned this to me. This is a concern that the forces are gathering and they're trying to sort of diverted tension away and as it were get this like grassroots kind of movement, which has kind of just emerged from the streets, diverted down a cul-de-sac. Any thoughts on that at all, Mark?
Well, I think we have to have an assessment of Black Lives Matter.
Yeah.
They cropped up some years ago. I was on their demos. Whoosh, they were there like a firework and then gone again. And same with Occupy, Extinction Rebellion. They don't really have a manifesto. They don't have demands. They're just about demos. And I think that you have to go beyond demos. It's not just enough to mobilize loads of people. In fact, it would be negligent if you mobilize so many people and raised their expectations and then nothing came of it. You end up going down a rabbit hole of revolt. And we've seen that with deaths in custody. You'll know that there were uprisings after the police killing of Mark Duggan in 2011. Yes, but what came of it? After 1981, when I was in Brixton, and there was the Operation Swamp, the strip searching of Black youth using the old sus law to stop and search them. And there was a revolt for a few days and then it was all over. I think we've got to continue this. And that's where, as elders, if you like, we have a responsibility not to try and take over this energy and this resistance, to support it, to give those at the forefront the benefit of our wisdom and our knowledge. Yeah. And that's what we're doing in Grassroots Black Left. We're actually having a Zoom meeting on Friday.
Okay.
To discuss as activists what our approach should be. But I think we're quite clear that we're playing a supportive role.
Yes.
Our job is to support the activists fighting for justice for George Floyd, the students, the youth, not to try and say that we know best, like Stand Up to Racism and other outfits, Hope Not Hate, and we own the product that is called the fight against racism. Also, I think we should be cognizant, we should be mindful that to be an anti-racist is not just about saying you're an anti-racist.
Yeah.
It's about actively confronting your personal racism as a white person. And I think all men are sexist and we have to combat sexism. Heterosexual people have to combat their innate homophobia, Islamophobia. It's an active process. And I saw, for instance, from a university in a letter just today, the dean of school saying we shouldn't have put out a statement saying we support Black Lives Matter as an anti-racist institution. We're not necessarily we are not an anti-racist institution until we can prove it. And we have a way to go. And we really shouldn't have said as an anti-racist institution. We should have said as an institution striving to be anti-racist and wanting to work with its Black students and Black staff to achieve that goal.
Yeah. Mark, you've mentioned that you've been on the demonstrations, the protests in London, and I've spoken to a number of people who similarly have been there, and they said that the way the policing has been conducted leaves a lot to be desired, to say the least. And people have told me that there's a real abuse of the Section 50 of the Police Reform Act, and protesters being kettled and so on. What's your thoughts on that? And did you witness any of this yourself?
I was kettled myself.
We saw the police cavalry charge, what's your thoughts on that, Mark?
Well, I witnessed it myself. I was kettled at the weekend.
Right, yeah.
And I spoke to the police and I said, what's going on? And they said, oh, well, some young people were throwing bottles at us and we think we can identify who they are, and you're not allowed to go anywhere until the helicopter has gone over and zoomed in with its telescopic cameras and found the people that we want to catch. That's wide open to abuse. I also witnessed a police van driving at speed into protesters. I mean, they scattered and no one was injured. Someone was knocked off a bike. Fortunately, he was okay.
Right.
But to just exonerate the police and say that they've been softly, and these sort of things haven't happened. I saw a white woman being pushed very aggressively. Fortunately, she didn't fall on the ground. And I think that this is symptomatic that the police force is the coercive arm of the state. It's there to protect the ruling class and the ruling class property. And it's a sort of us and them. And they have that mentality in their heads that the people are the enemy. And we saw that during the miners' strike in 1984 and Orgreave and other instances where they attacked peaceful striking miners. We saw it at Wapping, and I was at Wapping when the printers were attacked and the police were used like a private army of Rupert Murdoch, the owner of the newspapers that wanted to go union free. So we have to have a complete root and branch change in the way, not just that police are trained to be quote unquote anti-racist and go through race awareness training. The whole notion of policing has got to change. They've got to become the people's police. You know, they could march with us. They could have long hair like in Scandinavia. My mother comes from Finland.
Yeah.
And policing is very different over there.
Yeah.
It seems more collaborative, more community-based, rather than militarized, tasing people. I mean, God help us if they ever got guns in Britain.
No, indeed. I mean, one of the ways in which the older heads, people like yourself and so on, perhaps could assist, though, is in offering advice and assistance in relation to the application. I'm not talking about to the young activists and so on, of the abuse of Section 50 and what protesters' rights are. Because looking at some of the commentary that people have put on social media and speaking directly to people who have been in attendance at the demonstrations, or the way the kettling, it was the police lines, as I understand it, were very wide at first, and then they pushed people. People had nowhere near, in the first instance, any trouble. So that was a lot of nonsense. The people were kept there till the early hours of the morning, really struggling to get back home. But potentially, I'm just speaking actually to some lawyers today about whether they would do some sort of pro bono work to offer advice to protesters, some of the young people that have been involved, so they know their rights, because a lot of people are new to protest and don't necessarily know what their rights actually are. Is that something you think that could usefully be done to help in these situations?
Well, I was pleased to see that there were quite a few legal observers around.
Yeah.
Paralegals, solicitors working for free, barristers, and there were bus cards handed out explaining to people their rights, that you don't have to give your name or address if you're stopped, unless you're actually arrested. And then the police have to tell you under what section of the law you're being arrested, and they have to give you a note. And so you need to know your rights. And Grassroots Black Left is actually going to be producing some bus cards.
Good.
In addition to those points about your rights, to say you are also legally entitled to film the police, provided you are not obstructing them in the operation of their job. You can do a Darnella Fraser and film their actions. And we encourage as Grassroots Black Left for members of the public to do that. I remember when I was the leader of the Anti-Racist Alliance, which I founded in 1991, it became Britain's largest black movement, Europe's largest black-led movement. that we had a sister organization, SOS Racism, in France. And they had a very popular campaign called Hand Off My Friend. I can't say that in French, and I'm sure there's someone out there that knows how to say it. And they had badges and T-shirts. And it was precisely about this sort of intervention. And if you see police brutality going on, if you see bad practice with officers, that you should intervene. Now, people obviously have to be safe. They shouldn't put their safety in jeopardy. But wherever possible, we should be the eyes and ears of the public, and we should be vigilant.
You know, that police van that you mentioned as well, Mark, was that the Territorial Support Group or another police vehicle, do you know? Because I remember, as I understand it, the TSG replaced the infamous Special Patrol Group that was, I think, disbanded. Was it in the late 80s? I think. I mean, you may have been involved in that campaign.
SPG, yes, that's right.
The SPG. Well, you've got the TSG now, haven't you? And they've got about 700 odd Metropolitan Police officers, and I think they're performing a similar role to the SPG. And I know some people have got real concerns about the TSG and some of their activities. I don't know if you've experienced any adverse actions by the TSG yourself, or whether you've got any thoughts about the TSG and whether it's a legitimate group within the Metropolitan Police Service, or whether that should be disbanded as well and a different system adopted.
Well, I've seen them in their dark blue vans, their navy blue vans, and it sends a shiver down your spine.
Yeah.
You think what they're capable of, because they are paramilitaries, it seems. They're all tooled up. And sometimes it's a sort of macho thing for them, I think, that they want to teach the youth, the black youth, a lesson and say, we run the streets, we're the bosses. Yeah. And that's why I love the slogan, whose streets? Our streets. Because and that cuts to the point that we, the public, the taxpayers, pay for the police. They are public servants. They are not our masters.
No, for sure.
The whole nature of policing has to change. And these special units, I mean, I was subject to a special unit, the Special Demonstration Squad, which was spying on campaigns like the Stephen Lawrence Justice Campaign. My phone was tapped. I was followed around. And I'm now the subject. I'm now a core participant of the Judge Mitting, the High Court Judge Mitting inquiry into undercover policing. Could you imagine that Stephen Lawrence, an 18-year-old black male, was viciously murdered by a racist gang in 1993, April 1993, in the streets of Eltham at night. And not a single one of his murderers, the A courts, Neil and Jamie, have been apprehended, prosecuted, and jailed. Just their accomplices, Dobson and Norris. The actual murderers are still walking free because of collusion that went on between the South London underworld and corrupt police officers. And yet they were spying on us. So rather than concentrating on capturing the killers, they were spying on the justice campaigners. And that's happened right across the piece. It's happened with environmentalists, peace campaigners, trade unionists who've been blacklisted. And we really do need to have a rethink and a change, root and branch, to the way that the security services operate, the police operate. There are rogue squads out there that just seem to be completely out of control. Commanders say that they don't know what these people are doing.
No, indeed.
And I don't want
many incidents, as you say, Mark, of the the excesses that the police in this country indulge in. There was the infamous case of relatively recently of a young black man with his child in the petrol station.
That's right, the tasered.
Yes, in front of his child. I mean, his kid thought he'd been shot dead. His kid was obviously hysterical. Yeah. What a thing to do. What a thing to do. Unbelievable, in my opinion.
Happened in Bristol.
Happened in the
with a Rasta, a friend of mine. Again, it goes back to not just one rotten apple. There was a banner on one of, or a placard on one of the demos from one of the youths saying, "It's not one bad apple, the tree is rotten."
Indeed, yeah, or an orchard. Yeah,
that's right. And we cannot use that excuse anymore.
No.
That in the police force they reflect society, so there are bad to be some bad uns. No, we don't accept that argument, because the police are supposed to be highly trained. They're highly paid. Yeah. They're pampered. They get free travel on transport. Yeah, they get huge pensions.
Of course, yeah.
So we don't expect them to be the same as the general public.
No,
we expect them to be exemplars, to be better than. Yeah. And that's just a smokescreen.
Sure. I mean, there's a wider issue, of course, and absolutely there needs to be a huge improvement in police standards, but it can't just be about, in my opinion, simply saying, well, everything will be rosy in the garden if we can just get the police operating properly. There are many other structural issues in society that mean that there is disproportionate levels of poverty amongst the black community and so on. And we you know, and disproportionately represented in low-paid occupations, etc. Look, nobody should be in poverty in the 5th biggest economy in the world anyway. So I think there's a wider issue that we can't just, in my opinion anyway, focus on the police. We absolutely have to focus on the police, but that shouldn't be, in my opinion, the only focus of our attention. There are much wider issues at play that need attention too. And I think you know, we're potentially letting the establishment off the hook if we simply say, well, this is all about bad policing. Obviously, bad policing is a you know, huge issue, and we need to deal with it. But I think there's a wider societal, there's wider kind of economic issues that need to be dealt with at the same time.
It's about power.
On, Mark. Yes,
and white supremacy.
Yeah,
that has existed since the beginning of slavery 400 years ago. And I think every white person has to examine their soul and ask themselves the question: am I part of the solution, or am I still part of the problem? And as you say, it's got to work its way like a tidal wave, like a tsunami, through the whole of society.
No, indeed.
But there are certain individuals and organizations that I would expect to be in the forefront.
Very much so. Absolutely, yeah.
Giving solidarity, like the Labour Party, like the Labour movement.
Yes, indeed. Absolutely, yeah, indeed. And what was interesting, Mark, from my perspective, in Derby anyway, and I think this was reflected elsewhere, is that there wasn't, in evidence anyway, the obvious kind of totems of the Labour movement at that rally. You know, I didn't see the kind of trade union banners and things like that showing their kind of visible solidarity. I'm sure there were trade unionists there, obviously. I'm a trade unionist, you know. But you know, it very much was a grassroots, organic movement that had emerged in a very, very short notice. But in Derby, and I think elsewhere, with people who, you know, not really had any experience, if you like, in you know, in the Labour movement, in organising demonstrations and so on, and they managed to somehow mobilise the biggest rally that Derby's ever seen. And as I've said, that seems to be being reflected elsewhere. I mean, so yes, absolutely, the Labour movement does need to step up and be there shoulder to shoulder, because it's about solidarity, isn't it? I think we have to demonstrate you know, solidarity with each other in that sense too.
But on the terms of the demonstrators, on the terms of the young protesters. Yes. Like, let me give you an example. Activists, grassroots black activists in Sheffield were in touch with me, and they said, oh, what should our approach be? We've offered stewards. You know, we've said, you know, what can we do? Make some placards. And the youth said, no, you can print some leaflets for us, but thanks, but no thanks to your offer as stewards.
No, indeed.
I mean, I think that's perfectly right. You know, we play backup. We follow their lead, and that's kind of new to us, I think.
No, indeed. I think we should celebrate that. I mean, that's brilliant. I mean, you know, if people are being mobilised and engaged, and you know that haven't traditionally been so, that is something, of course, for celebration from my perspective, anyway.
Yes.
Listen, Mark, we better go to some.
We've got to keep it going, as one of the placards said. This is a movement, not a moment.
No, absolutely, and that's the key, because we've had lots of moments in the past, haven't we? I mean, incredible moments. I mean, you know, the slaying of Malcolm X, the slaying of Martin Luther King. I mean, these are, you know, huge, totemic, massive figures, you know. You know, we
But
saw
it happened here as well.
Oh yes, yes, and absolutely.
Look over the pond and think about these leaders and Mandela in South Africa.
Yeah, yeah.
But in our midst, we got people like Paul Stevenson, who led the Bristol bus boycott
absolutely.
back in the 60s.
Huge figure,
and he should have been on a plinth as a statue, as a hero.
Absolutely right, mate. I mean, that would be he would be an excellent candidate, wouldn't he, to replace the Coulson statue with him? Because yes, a huge figure, and not enough is known about him, and you know, many other examples like that, I think, are really important. Mark, just conscious of the time, and we're getting quite a lot of questions in now, and from viewers, and perhaps if I could just put some of those to you and get your thoughts. I've got one here from Jocelyn. She's saying, how do we politically educate the workforce in the workplace on these matters? What's your thoughts on that?
Well, I lived in Lambeth, which takes in Brixton, for 20 years. And I'm aware that the town hall is the largest employer. And they have improved the representation of Black workers in the workforce. I think it's now more than 40%. But then when you look at where those Black workers are, what jobs they're in the lowest grades. If you look at the disciplinary rates for Black workers, they're higher than for white workers. They're less likely to be able to keep their job, last in, first out. Unions, trade unions can play a huge role in supporting workers. Black workers need to be represented on trade union committees and in the leadership of trade unions. And, you know, there's a lot to be done. You know, there's the Lambeth Black Workers, there are Black workers groups in town halls around the country. And, you know, there needs to be now a proper engagement, a proper dialogue with employers to see that there is change on the ground, in the workplace, in the factory. Because if that doesn't happen peacefully, you've heard the slogan, no justice, no peace, there will be a great deal of anger building up.
Yeah.
And I don't want people to take matters into their own hands. But this is not just for Black people. This is for Britain and for white people. We want to peacefully coexist. We want everyone to get on with each other. But you know, people's patience, Black people's patience, isn't endless, and a lot of frustration and grievance is building up and has built up. And I've heard about it firsthand from Black workers.
Yeah. I mean, and it's kind of linked, I suppose, this next question here. Somebody's asking, how can we support each other against the propaganda being spewed out by some of the kind of right-wing forces in the country?
Well, political education is at a premium. There's not much of it that goes on in the Labour Party, I'm afraid. In the trade union movement, used to have a tradition like Ruskin College, where you could go in. I did a course on Ruskin College. The Workers' Education Association. I mean, I don't hear about these groups anymore. And that's why it's important that organizations like Grassroots Black Left, I've actually crafted what I've called a liberation school, which I piloted in Cardiff at the RMT, that's the Rail and Maritime Workers, Transport Workers Unions Black Members Conference. Mm-hmm. And so I think we have to look to our own resources in communities, in trade unions, in community organizations to fill that void. I mean, I remember as a young teenager, as the only Black person in my school, that I almost had a parallel education going on, ordering books about Malcolm X and the Panthers and Amilcar Cabral and Frantz Fanon and Angela Davis and Steve Biko and, you know, authors from all around the world. I ordered those books and I self-educated. You know, I educated myself about George Jackson and the Soledad Brothers. I grew up in the era of Black Power and Black Pride and the Afro. Mm-hmm. And that has been, you know, really the basis of my politics. And then I connected with the anti-apartheid struggle and the trade union movement, and that shaped me. So some of this is personal. We have to take it upon ourselves to educate ourselves, but also organizations need to be more active in promoting, in a sense, an alternative education to the class-based education that we get in British schools at the moment, about the kings and queens of England. We don't hear about the slave revolts in the Caribbean.
No, exactly. I mean, the Workers' Education Associations used to do some great work. They seem to have be less obvious, certainly locally anyway. I mean, they were quite a big presence in Derby. I'm not sure what's happened to them, actually. I've not seen much of their activity at all over the last few years, but something like that, I think, would certainly be helpful if we could kind of re-energize the Workers' Education Association. But let me just move on if I can, Mark. There's a question here from Denny's McNulty, I think the name is, just saying, how do we get this movement to become recognized in a political role to push through change? What's your thoughts?
Get it recognized? I don't think it's waiting for recognition. It's there on the map. You know,
I think they're probably. I think what Denny's is getting at there, perhaps what she's getting at behind that question is, it's definitely on the map. But how can we drive through the change that is needed, as it were, through that movement? How can we make sure that they aren't just shouting into the wind, as it were, but actually that physical change, real change, is brought about as a consequence of this moment?
Well, two things. We know that George Floyd's death was the catalyst, the springboard. He mustn't be allowed to have died in vain. And secondly, that the way that the young people have organized, and you talked about social media, you talked about the internet, we had a conversation about that, provides us with the tools, new tools of speaking, having conversations, communicating with each other. And it means that it's an antidote also to the bile that sometimes is spewed out by the so-called mainstream media, including the BBC from time to time, which just represents the establishment. And by that, obviously, that's white privilege, that's too often sexism, homophobia, Islamophobia being reinforced by imagery, if not by sometimes commission, by omission. Those voices aren't included in mainstream coverage. We've got an alternative now. We've got citizen journalism. We can speak to each other unfiltered, remove the gatekeepers.
Yeah, no, indeed. I mean,
they're terrified of that. In fact, they're trying to incorporate it.
Yeah.
You'll see, they say, oh, send us your pictures, send us your videos.
No,
they want it all for free as well.
No, I do.
This is happening in local news.
I often wonder, Mark, if social media at the level it's at today had been around at the time of the miners' strike, whether the outcome might have been very different. But obviously that's something we can speculate, and indeed many other disputes and struggles that took place prior to this sort of advent of citizen journalism. There's a question here from Fabian Fry saying, here's a huge army of people with disabilities out there who are being treated just as badly. Why do we not support this group to get their message out as well, to unite this movement with many others?
Well, we must all be a part of the rainbow. That's what I believe in. I'm talking about disabled people need to unite with able-bodied people, men supporting the fight for women's liberation, LGBTQI+.
Yeah.
That's very important that we give solidarity. And I've seen that actually on these demonstrations. I've seen disabled people, I've seen trans people, I've seen, other people of the different sexual spectrum, able-bodied, white, black, young, old, working class, middle class people. And that's what I think we need to recreate. We had a bit of it in the 80s with the GLC, the Greater London Council, where there was support for a coalition of minorities. Of course, women aren't a minority, but they are oppressed.
No, indeed.
We need to revisit that. We need to revitalize that working together, that coming together, where we all respect each other's oppression and are prepared to be led by the oppressed in their fight for liberation.
No, indeed. And you mentioned the GLC, and of course, a lot of the credit for that, not exclusively, but certainly a lot of the credit, I think, should go to Ken Livingstone, who led that authority and pushed on those issues. And there's an irony of irony that you are one of the victims of the witch hunt, expelled as a lifelong anti-racist campaigner. I mean, your credentials are unimpeachable, as are Ken's, and of course, and he is yet another victim of the witch hunt. Someone else who was forced out of the Labour Party.
And you too.
Well, indeed, and many others as well. As a real sad irony. And
Walker.
Absolutely, Jackie Walker, yet another black Jewish woman who was similarly accused and falsely accused of anti-Semitism. But we know that anti-Zionist socialist Jews have been targeted. Just moving on, and it kind of linked in a way. There's a question from Phil Wagstaff, who's saying, "What do you both think actually of Starmer's comments of disapproval about pulling down the statue, and do you think more statues should be brought down?" Well, you kind of touched on this a little bit at the beginning, but I don't know if you want to kind of answer that directly, that point that Phil has put there about Starmer's remarks.
Well, I think that again, he's an example of white privilege. He just doesn't get it. I talked about him being tone deaf. Yes, he did say, and we should have put the whole of what he said in context, that statue should never have been there in the first place. But he went on to say they were wrong to pull it down. No, they weren't. He didn't say that about Saddam's statue coming down in Iraq. And it's just a case of double standards. And I just think he doesn't have black advisors around him. And I did criticize Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell for this. They just have white public school boys they tend to have around them. So it's not just a race issue, it's a class issue.
No, indeed.
Well, and I just think he's badly advised, and he needs to roll up his sleeves and come into the black community and hear what we have to say and act on our demands. We call it the black agenda. And that's what's missing at the moment. He's out of touch. He seems to be in some ivory tower in Westminster.
Well,
this is an example of it.
Another question. Jack T has said that Sir Keir appears to be too close to the establishment, particularly the police, and poses this question: even if we had a Labour government under him, would police behaviour improve?
It would only improve if we made sure in our communities that we have a community-based, a community-directed police force rather than an army of occupation, as it so often seems to be. That's what happened in Brixton in 81 and before, with Sus and Swamp and Orgreave with the miners. We've got to change the whole mindset of policing, police in this country.
Yeah.
And that's why I think at the moment, I'm going to be quite controversial and go back to what the black section said in the 80s. I don't think the police force is a fit place for black people or conscious working class people to join. I think it has to be cleaned up first before it's suitable.
Yeah. I think my response would be, in terms of that particular question, is that we don't simply rely on parliamentarians to bring about change. And people like Tony Benn always used to make this point, nothing's ever given really by the establishment, it has to be fought for. And so this moment in time, which hopefully will become a movement, not just simply a moment, as that placard that you mentioned earlier, Mark, we've got to push for this. We've got to force their hand and make sure that that change does come, that change is brought about. We can't simply sit back and rely on perhaps a Labour government coming to power and that, as it were, overcoming all of the ills of the world, because it certainly won't unless we bring pressure. And even when Jeremy, I was a big supporter of Jeremy, but my view was it's not just about just leaving it to Jeremy, although I agreed with most of what Jeremy was saying on his economic and foreign policy agenda. Well, everything, in fact, on that score, though I think we could have gone a bit further. And I mean, that was a point I was making, that we need to be pressing that leadership and, if you like, creating the space for them. Because if we just simply sit back and think, well, it's all going to be resolved by the election of a Corbyn-led Labour government. That wouldn't be the case, or wouldn't have been the case. I know we didn't get there, but there would still be an absolute desperate need for pressure from below to push even a Corbyn-led Labour government. I think that absolutely applies with a potential, I think the chances are fairly unlikely under Keir Starmer, but if that were to come to pass, we need to be, building a movement to bring pressure to bear. Just moving on, though, if I may, Mark, and I'm just conscious of the time. We've gone past 8 o'clock, but because we didn't start until 10 past 8 because of the technical difficulties, I thought we could run, if you're okay with that, Mark, until 10 past 8, so that we get the full hour in, because people were expecting that. But there's a question here from Monica Shannon. She's saying, what about the Palestinians, the Irish in the past, and the Native Americans and South American natives who were ruthlessly, well, I mean, there was a kind of genocide that went on, wasn't there, in the USA, and ruthlessly put down, and we know what's happening, liberation struggles around the world, and so Monica's asking, how, again, I suppose, how do we link them up, I guess, is the issue that's behind her question. What's your thoughts on that, Mark?
I think they're linking organically, and I'm very pleased to see that you've got the Palestinian flag behind you.
Yes.
On your wall. I've actually been to Jordan, right smack bang next to the West Bank. I wasn't allowed in by the Israeli Defense Force. The Jordanians have let them run security into the West Bank. So you can only really get into Palestine, or, what is the Palestine administration, through Israel. No, these people around the world, oppressed people around the world, are instinctively getting involved. I mean, I was moved by a mural of George Floyd on the wall of a building in Syria that had been bombed by, I don't know, the Americans or the American-backed forces in Syria. And in defiance, George Floyd's mural. Have you seen it? Have you seen pictures of it?
I've not seen it, but that's incredible. Yeah, I mean,
all there. And this is happening in Mexico.
Yes.
This is happening in Brazil.
Yeah.
All around the world, oppressed people are making the connections. Native Americans on the march with us side by side in the USA. And let's remember that they were the first to suffer the hammer blows.
Indeed.
Of genocide.
Yes.
In America. America is built on genocide. Indeed. And slavery.
Absolutely. Genocide.
And so I think the connections are happening organically. It's not something we even have to sort of spend our time strategizing on how we link with the oppressed people. The oppressed people, we're coming together to fight a common enemy.
Yeah. I guess it comes back as well, doesn't it, to the kind of this new technology, the kind of citizen journalism that you mentioned, and the fact that we are able to make connections around the country and internationally now as well. And obviously what's happening, even in somewhere like Syria, with all the trials and tribulations that the people in Syria have been subjected to, able to show solidarity in that way. That's, again, incredibly inspiring. And, the old Marxist rallying cry about workers of the world unite. Well, maybe we've got an opportunity to make that happen. That's why, I keep saying the kind of grassroots movement that we are trying to build, this resistance movement, has to be an anti-imperialist movement, an internationalist movement, because we have much more in common with struggles of working class communities around the world than we have with the people, the billionaire class from our own country in that sense. So
can I come in and say that, we'll remember back in the horror days of the colour bar, that signs in windows,
oh my God,
homes to let, or places to let, had no blacks, no dogs, no Irish.
Yes, absolutely.
And I've been involved in supporting that struggle since the very early 80s. I visited the Falls Road as guest of Sinn Féin. I worked, had a meeting with Jerry Adams,
yeah,
who said to me, look, we put up murals of Nelson Mandela in Republican areas so that the youth, the Irish youth, understand the connection.
Oh, yes, it's incredible.
It's not just about the Irish struggle.
No, indeed.
It's about fighting apartheid and supporting the fight against racism.
Well, I've been to Belfast. I've seen on the Falls Road and those murals, incredibly internationalist. And again, it's a wonderful sight to behold, and very much identifying with liberation struggles from all over the world. And that's so important, I think. And we need to, draw strength from that, I think, from that example.
And look how the Cubans have lent medical support during this COVID crisis. They've sent them to Spain, Italy. In fact, there was a suggestion that they should get a Nobel Prize for it. And many of those medics, those doctors, are black.
Yes, indeed. Exporting, peace and love around the world rather than inflicting misery, terror, and mass slaughter that we see the United States doing with its imperialist wars that they have been inflicting on the world for, well, best part of 70 years and more. This will probably have to be the last question, and apologies again. We always have this problem. There are more questions than we're able to give answers to, regrettably. But this one's from Becky, and it's related to the Labour Party. Becky Matthews-Massey. She's saying, will the Labour Party learn anything from this? They're harbouring racist staffers, she says, and have ignored anti-black racism. A lot of black members have been suspended. Well, you're one of them, been suspended and expelled. Do you think the Labour Party will learn anything from this, Mark? I
think it depends on the members. I don't think you can rely on the leadership.
No.
And your point about pressure from below, this is going to come from organised labour and the trade unions, black members getting active and making demands. And we kind of, sort of rested on our laurels because we've had successes. And now there are more black faces in high places, including black MPs. And we need a movement. It's almost like plugging in the electricity power source. We are the movement, we're the electricity.
Yeah.
And at the moment, I think a lot of them are unplugged.
Yeah.
And they need activating.
Yes.
And the reason why, it's not because they're bad individuals, it's because the movement outside, change comes from outside. The suffragette movement, which we celebrated 100 years of last year, that came from outside, the women's right to vote, although it was women over 30 who had certain property rights, but it was a move forward. The civil rights movement in the States, the Black Power movement, that didn't start in Congress on Capitol Hill. That started outside. The trade union movement, fighting for workers' rights so that youngsters, as young as 10 or 11 or 12 were sent down mines. That all started outside. So I actually welcome the fact that with the state of the Labour Party and its current right-wing leadership, that this has given us a boost to get back into our communities, back into our workplaces, back on the streets to fight for black rights and justice for George Floyd and against racism and imperialism and capitalism, that we've got to redouble our efforts now to be active. And I would say that it's no point going around calling yourself an activist if you're not active. Get out there, support the young people.
Absolutely. I mean, and Fred Hampton, the iconic Black Panther, once said that you defeat racism with solidarity and overcome capitalism with socialism. And I think that is something that we should sort of use as our rallying cry going forward. Mark, we've run out of time. Thanks very much indeed for your generosity and coming back on the programme and being so open and frank with the discussion this evening. And clearly it sparked a lot of interest, and we've been overwhelmed with questions and have been unable, as I've already said, to respond to them all. We do have another special edition of Resistance TV tomorrow evening at 6:30 when Matt Kennard, the investigative journalist who founder of Declassified UK, will be speaking about GCHQ, spying on our kids, and also the connections between the leader of the opposition and the security services, the former American Attorney General, and his membership of the Trilateral Commission, and his involvement in the Assange affair, and his relationship with the Murdoch empire. So that will be an interesting program. So if you've got a spare hour tomorrow, please tune in at 6:30 when we'll be speaking to Matt Kennard. Thanks for watching. Thank you again, Mark, and good night.